The creek bed had been dry for 11 weeks. That was why Owen Rusk stopped when his old cattle dog came back from it with wet whiskers. Milo was 13, stiff through the hips, half-deaf, and no longer interested in wasting steps. Yet every afternoon, when the August heat pressed the cattle into the shade, he left the porch, crossed the baked lane, and disappeared into a ravine where no water had run since spring. Then he came back with mud on his paws. At first, Owen assumed the dog had found a pocket left from an old storm. By the fourth day, that explanation no longer made sense. There had been no storm, and Milo kept returning to the exact same pile of stones. Owen and his wife, Leah, had bought the 58-acre place in the Missouri Ozarks 5 years earlier. It had been a small dairy once, then a hay farm, then mostly neglected ground with a tired barn, 2 usable pastures, and a deep well that had never been designed to carry the whole farm through a long drought. They were trying to make it work with 17 beef cows, rotational grazing, and the kind of accounting that happened after supper, with a calculator beside 2 cups of coffee. That summer, the numbers were moving the wrong way. The lower pond had shrunk to a muddy oval. The shallow trough by the north fence had gone dry in July. The electric well pump was running longer every week, and the pump man had warned Owen that the motor was drawing more current than it should. Replacing it would cost more than Owen wanted to say out loud. Buying hay early would cost almost as much. The worst part was that the farm still had grass in places the cattle could not use efficiently. The ridge pasture had decent cover, but no reliable water. If Owen moved the herd up there, he had to haul water with a tank in the bed of his truck. 1 trip was manageable. 3 trips a day, every day, turned grazing into a fuel bill and a chore schedule. So the cattle stayed too long in the lower ground, where the well-fed trough was close enough to trust. By mid-August, the grass around that trough had been grazed shorter than Owen liked, and every afternoon, Milo walked past all of it and vanished into a dry creek. One day he came back with something green stuck beneath his chin. Owen bent down and pulled it free. Moss, not dried moss. Fresh, dark green moss. Cool enough that a bead of water remained on Owen's thumb after he touched it. He looked toward the ravine. Then he picked up a shovel. The dry creek ran along the east edge of the property, below a wooded slope where limestone shelves broke through the soil. Owen had cleared fallen branches from it before, but there had never been a reason to climb into the narrow upper fork where Milo kept going. The dog led him there without being called. Under a tangle of blackberry canes, Milo stopped beside a low mound of flat stones stacked against the bank. It looked almost natural until Owen noticed that the largest stones were laid with their edges facing outward. Someone had placed them. Milo pushed his nose into a dark gap near the bottom. Owen heard water. Not much, just a faint, steady trickle beneath the stones. He pulled away vines and leaf litter until he found a shallow channel no wider than his hand. Cold water slid through it and disappeared under a slab of rock. The creek bed below was still dry because the flow never made it that far. It vanished underground almost immediately, but it was flowing. Owen knelt in the heat with one hand in water cold enough to make his fingers ache. For a few seconds, he forgot about the well pump. Then he started moving stones. He worked carefully, expecting a natural seep or maybe the remains of an old spring house. What he uncovered was stranger. Behind the stone face sat a rusted length of iron pipe. A few feet below it, half buried in silt, was a heavy cast iron body with a rounded chamber on top and 2 valve housings underneath. Owen knew machinery. He had repaired hay equipment, truck starters, mower gearboxes, and more fence chargers than he could count. But he had never seen this thing working. Leah found him there an hour later with mud to his elbows and Milo asleep in the only cool patch of shade. "What is it?" she asked. Owen wiped the rust with his thumb. "I think it's a pump, with no wires. That's the part I don't understand." The next morning, Owen carried 2 photographs into the farm supply store in town. The owner looked at the first one, turned the phone sideways, and called a retired pump installer named Hal Bishop from the back room where he sometimes drank coffee with the regulars. Hal studied the picture for less than 10 seconds. "Hydraulic ram," he said. Owen waited. Hal handed the phone back. "Old water pump, runs on falling water, no motor, no electricity. If that spring has enough flow and somebody gave the drive pipe enough drop, the pump can use the water's own momentum to push a smaller amount uphill." Owen looked at him again. "Uphill how far?" Hal shrugged. "Depends on the site. Depends on the fall. Depends on the pipe. Depends on how much of that old system is still there. Don't hear free water and start planning irrigation. A ram pump wastes some water to move some water. That's how it works." That caution mattered. 2 days earlier, a different kind of water problem had already been sitting on Owen's kitchen table. The pump company had left him an estimate for pulling the deep well motor if it failed completely. The number was high enough that Leah had turned the paper face down after reading it. They could probably cover the repair if they had to. But covering it would mean using the money set aside for winter hay. Buying the hay later on credit would push the problem into spring instead of solving it. That was how the drought had been working on them. Nothing had failed all at once. Every weak point simply became more expensive at the same time. Owen had already tried hauling water to the ridge. He owned a portable tank that could carry a few hundred gallons, but a full load changed how the old pickup handled on the steep lane. He had to fill it, crawl uphill in low gear, drain it into the stock tank, drive back down, and do it again before evening if the cattle were drinking heavily. After 3 days, he moved the herd back to the lower pasture. The grass was worse there, but the water was close. That decision bothered him because it meant the farm's limitation was no longer forage. It was distribution. He had feed standing on one part of the property and animals concentrated on another because he could not move water economically between them. Owen did not need a miracle. He needed enough water in the right place. The ridge pasture sat well above the spring, but an old concrete stock tank stood near its lower corner, dry and cracked around the rim. Owen had always assumed it had been filled from a water truck in the dairy years. Now he walked from the tank downhill with a fencing probe, following the most direct line toward the ravine. About 30 yards from the tank, the probe struck metal, then again, and again. A buried pipe climbed the slope almost exactly where it needed to. That was when possibility turned into a problem worth solving. For 2 evenings, Owen exposed short sections of the old delivery line. Most of it was badly corroded. One joint had split. Another had filled with roots. Whatever the ram pump had once delivered, the original pipe could no longer be trusted. He also found the remains of a rotted wooden cover over the spring intake and a drive pipe packed with gravel. The system had not been quietly waiting for someone to flip a switch. It was broken in several different ways. Owen spent Saturday cleaning the intake. That was his first mistake. He pulled too much silt at once, clouding the spring and sending muddy water into the drive pipe. The flow dropped instead of improving. By late afternoon, the little channel that had first caught his attention was barely moving. Owen sat on a stone with his muddy boots in the dry creek and stared at a pump that looked older than anyone still living on the road. He had wanted the discovery to mean something immediately. Instead, he had made it worse. Hal came out the next morning. He did not touch the pump for the first 15 minutes. He walked the spring. He checked the elevation change by sight. Then, with a simple level, he followed the old drive pipe. He looked at the slope toward the ridge tank. Finally, he crouched beside the cast iron body. "Your spring is small," he said. "But it doesn't have to be big if your demand is small and steady. The real question is whether it keeps flowing in dry weather." "It's August," Owen said. Hal nodded. That's the best thing you've got going for you. They let the spring clear for a day before doing anything else. When they returned, the trickle had recovered. Hal showed Owen how the old machine was supposed to work. Water accelerated down the drive pipe. A waste valve shut suddenly. The moving water created a pressure pulse. A second valve allowed a small amount into the air chamber and then into the delivery line. The pump did not create water. It traded flow for lift. Most of the spring water would continue downhill. A smaller portion, delivered over many hours, could climb to the ridge. That was enough to change the problem. Owen did not need to water 58 acres from the spring. He needed to stop hauling every gallon to the ridge pasture and give the well fewer hours of work. He and Hal removed the rusted valve assembly and found that one rubber seal had hardened almost to plastic. The air chamber was intact, but the threaded connection beneath it leaked. The drive pipe needed to be cleared and reset. The old uphill delivery pipe was beyond saving. Owen priced the parts before he bought anything. A new pump system would have cost more than he could justify. Rebuilding the existing body, replacing the failed valve parts, and running modern water line to the old ridge tank was different. Still not free, but possible. Leah asked the question Owen had been avoiding. What if it only gives us a bucket an hour? Owen looked toward the lower pasture, where the cows had already grazed around the good spots twice. Then we learned that before we spend money on the well, that became the rule. Test before betting the farm on it. Before buying the uphill line. Owen and Hal spent a day measuring what the spring actually did. They set a temporary channel under the seep and timed how long it took to fill a marked bucket. They repeated the check in the morning in the heat of afternoon, and again near dark. The flow was not impressive, but it was steady. That steadiness mattered more than a single strong reading. A spring that surged after rain and vanished 2 days later would not solve Owen's problem. A smaller flow that survived the driest part of August might. Hal also made him measure the vertical climb to the ridge instead of guessing from the road. The old dairy farmer, who installed the system, had not chosen that ravine by accident. There was enough drop above the pump for the drive water to build momentum, and the old delivery route climbed toward the tank on a gentler line than Owen had noticed from the truck. None of that guaranteed success. The ram would only send a fraction of the incoming water uphill, and friction in a long delivery line could take more of that away. But for the first time, Owen could see the shape of a testable system, rather than a lucky puddle under a pile of rocks. They rebuilt the pump in stages. Owen flushed the spring intake without digging deeper into the bank. He set a screened inlet where the water naturally collected. He cleared the old drive pipe and replaced only the section that had collapsed. He ran new black polyethylene line from the pump up the slope instead of trying to salvage the corroded delivery pipe. At the ridge tank, he installed a simple float valve and an overflow line that returned excess water toward a rocky swale instead of turning the tank area into mud. On the first test, nothing happened. Water moved down the drive pipe and spilled through the waste valve, but the pump never settled into rhythm. Owen adjusted it. Still nothing. Hal listened, then pointed to the drive pipe. A high spot in the line was trapping air. They reset one section lower, secured it, and tried again. The valve snapped shut. A second later it opened. Then shut again. Thump, release. Thump, release. The old pump found a rhythm that had been missing from the ravine for years. Owen and Leah climbed to the ridge tank and waited. For a while, there was nothing at the end of the new line. Then it coughed air. A thin stream of water appeared. Not a gush, not even close. Just cold spring water running into an empty tank at a rate that looked almost disappointing if you watched it for 1 minute. Owen watched for 10. The level rose. They marked it with a pencil on the inside wall and came back after supper. It had risen again. By morning, the tank held enough water to prove the point. Owen shut the outlet and let the pump work through most of the next day, while he checked for leaks. By evening, the tank had gained several hundred gallons. The exact amount varied with the spring flow and the pump adjustment, but it was enough to replace the water he had been hauling in the pickup. That distinction kept the discovery honest. The system was useful because it ran continuously, not because it moved a spectacular amount of water at once. A thin stream that never needed fuel could accomplish more in 24 hours than it seemed capable of in 60 seconds. The spring could not irrigate the hayfield. It could not replace the deep well for the house. It could not support unlimited cattle in a drought. But it could do one job all day and all night without a motor. It could keep drinking water moving to the ridge. That single job changed how Owen could use the farm. Within a week, he moved part of the herd uphill. The cattle spread out instead of crowding the lower trough. The graze downfield below finally got rest. Owen stopped making daily water hauling trips. The deep well still ran, but fewer hours than before. The savings were not dramatic enough for a newspaper headline. They were dramatic enough to show up on the electric bill. More important, the ridge pasture stopped being stranded grass. It became usable ground. Through September, Owen rotated the cattle between paddocks he had avoided during the worst part of summer. The lower field did not turn green overnight, but it held more cover. When rain finally returned, the rested plants responded faster than the ground around the old trough. The farm had not been rescued by a hidden river. It had been helped by a small spring, an old machine, and a dog too sensible to ignore the coolest place he could find. Owen kept one more rule from the whole experience. He never again called a piece of ground useless until he understood why it behaved the way it did. The stone spring, the dry ridge tank, the buried pipe, the ravine everyone stepped over. They had looked like separate leftovers from a farm that no longer existed. Together, they had been a system, a neglected one, but a system all the same. By early October, the days cooled enough that Milo stopped making his afternoon trip into the ravine. He had no reason to. Most evenings, he followed Owen up to the ridge, drank from the stock tank, and settled in the shade beside the fence, while the cattle grazed across ground they had barely touched all summer. One evening, Owen looked down the hill toward the dry creek and could faintly hear the old ram pump working below. Thump, release, thump. Milo lifted one ear, then put his head back on his paws. For the first time all summer, he had no reason to go looking for water.